Well, can I welcome you here to our evenings with C.S. Lewis. This, I hope, will be an interesting time for all of us. I find Lewis a intriguing person, and I know that many of you have been influenced by his writings and who he is. So we're going to be exploring a number of things with him tonight, leading up to the middle of his career. And I'm very happy to receive questions or comments at any time. Greg has a microphone. It's all going to be recorded and filmed, so be aware of that. So if you've got a question, if you could ask Greg for that, and we'll capture it properly. Let's pray as we come to this examination of Lewis. He would approve of that, and I think we should take that seriously. Lord God, thank you that we can be out on an evening such as this to explore the life and writings of a person now long dead, but one whose influence continues to be felt. Thank you for the life of C.S. Lewis. We pray that we will learn from it and gain insights as we can read him further and know more about him and the Lord he sought to proclaim. Amen. Well, the witness of C.S. Lewis. Now, Lewis is probably, as Alan Jacobs suggests, the most influential writer of popular Christian literature in the 20th century in English. Now, if you qualify it 3 times like that, it narrows the field down a little bit. But some people would suggest that he's probably the best-selling Christian author of the entire 20th century, and he's got a fair claim to that. And if you Google, as I have done in the last few days, just to test theory, top 10 best-selling Christian books, some of the lists will come up with 3 of his as the first 3. So there's no question that he is a person of profound influence in the Christian world, but a fairly mixed heritage in the wider reception of him. So Michael Ward here suggests that C.S. Lewis is a controversial and enigmatic figure who continues to fascinate 60 years after his death. Now, for those of us who are fans of C.S. Lewis, you'll be wondering to yourself, what on earth is controversial about him? And why is he seen as being so enigmatic? Well, some of the details that we'll look at tonight will explain part of that, but it's certainly the case that he has received a mixed reception in academic theology. So Christianity Today, in about the turn of the century, named him as the most influential Christian writer of the 20th century. So Christianity Today, major Christian magazine in the United States. And in a list of the top 10, someone like Karl Barth, who was a great Swiss theologian and very influential in systematic theology, came in at a mere 4th after C.S. Lewis and a number of others. Now, that order would not be recognised in academic theology. He is seen as being a person who takes on theology from a whole lot of strange directions and is not particularly respected by academic theologians in general, although when you talk to them as individuals, and as I've had the privilege of doing so over a number of years, many will actually say that particularly in their early Christian life, that reading C.S. Lewis was a key turning point. So what we're going to try and explore is what drove him, what sort of person was he, and we're going to look at each evening at some of his writings to get a flavour of who he was and what he tried to say and what his key attitudes and prejudices were, because he certainly had some of those. Now, I have been interested in C.S. Lewis for a very long time, and as part of a group, put together a book on C.S. Lewis a number of years ago, trying to bridge this gap between popular writing and theological writing. So we came up with this book, A Myth Retold, Re-Encountering C.S. Lewis as a Theologian. And I have 4 copies left over. So if by the end of this you still want to know a bit more about Lewis's theological heritage, $15 each. You're welcome to those. But I started, I have to say, my C.S. Lewis journey in a very different mode. I was a very reluctant reader of C.S. Lewis. In 1972, I graduated from our Sunday school at the Darfield Anglican Church. And all those who graduated that year were handed a copy of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe in this edition. Not exactly this edition, because this is a later reprint of it, because it mentions the movies, but that same cover on it. Now, I was a 12-year-old boy. I was virtually a man. And I was disgusted with this prize at the end of our time. What's this girly book that I've been given? And look at the cover of it. Goodness me. A couple of girls with daisy chains dancing around a lion, a talking lion. Who do they think I am? So I came home and mentioned it grumpily to my mother, who had heard of C.S. Lewis and was a little bit more keen on me to read it. But I was determined not to, and I put it on the back shelf of a bookcase in my room and didn't look at it for another 2 years. I thought this was a thorough insult to a budding gentleman like myself. Now, some would say, rather cruelly, that with the gradually receding hairline and the gradually expanding girth, the attraction of C.S. Lewis became a little bit more obvious to me. But I think that's a terrible insult to make to anybody, and we'll clear that elephant from the room immediately, and we'll speak of it no further. In our series, we're going to look at him as a convert, a most reluctant convert, as he had described himself. We're going to look at next week at the broadcast talks which became the foundation for Mere Christianity, his best-selling book, and probably the best-selling Christian book of the 20th century. Then we'll skip ahead a little bit to the 4 ways to love, the 4 loves, which are a very telling description of his theological stance on relationships and his use of Greek and a whole host of ways. And the advantage of that book study will be that we have some recording of Lewis speaking and reading that series. So you will hear a fair bit of him in his own voice, as we will a little bit next week also. There are very few extant recordings of Lewis that are available at all. They all seem to have been lost. And you'll find that he actually sounds exactly like you think he's going to sound, like an Oxford Don. But he's very expressive, and it makes the passages come alive in a new way. And then on our 4th week, we're going to look into the Narnia series. And as I said to our church this morning, there's a few parental advisories on these earlier lectures. He's an adult writer to adults mostly. This is very much going to, on the 26th of October, going to be a study of the Narnia series as they are. So if you have children who've read them or grandchildren who've read them and interested in them, that would be a time to bring them along if they can stand a Sunday night out looking at C.S. Lewis. We're going to be exploring and enjoying the Narnia stories and understanding how they flow and what Lewis is trying to say through them. So a quick overview of his life. A life in stages, a life in pieces. Born in 1898, affected very dramatically by the death of his mother in 1908. In 1999, he enters Oxford University. He's converted in 1931 and married very late in life I've got 1908 there, that's not right. 1958, that should be. And then dies in 1963. So he's actually only 64 years old when he died. And half his life was lived before his conversion. So all these writings and influence happened in the second half of his life. But the first half of his life, we'll find, has to be taken very seriously into account because it explains who he is and what his interests are. And we can break that up in a number of ways. The first would be to look at the themes of his emotional life, where the first period up to his entry to Oxford can be described as a period of loss and alienation, then a period of discovery leading up to his conversion, a period of joy understood particularly in the unusual way that he defined the word joy. And then joy with an exclamation mark when he gets married to his wife, who's called Joy. What's happening within that period, the specifics of it? Little Lee is the name of the house that he was raised in. His schooling was unusual, and we'll look at how that affected him. He was involved in World War I towards the end of the war, and then returns to Oxford. He'd spent a brief period in Oxford before going to the front. Returned to Oxford, takes up a partnership with Mrs. Moore, who we'll talk further about, with Warney, his brother, Warren, known as Warney, and ultimately to a new home called the Kilns in 1931, same year as his conversion. And the Kilns becomes a character in some of the stories. Some of the Narnia stories reflect the structure and layout of the Kilns house. Now, the Kilns house still exists in Oxford. It's owned by the C.S. Lewis Trust, and you can go and visit it. You can have tours of the Kilns. And C.S. Lewis is particularly big in the American market, and thousands of Americans travel to Oxford every year to do the C.S. Lewis Trail. It's an example of how his legacy has been captured in different ways by different people. He's seen as basically as St. Clive over in America, and the evangelical, particularly conservative evangelical world, thinks very highly of him, probably in a fairly rose-tinted spectacles sort of way, actually, because there's many aspects of his life which wouldn't fit with a typical evangelical, or I might say New Zealand Baptist spirituality, but in many ways it just makes him more interesting. Then later in his life, after his marriage, a period of tranquility and grief, for his wife Joy dies after a few years of cancer, and he goes through a very profound grief period, which he writes about and explains, and he recovers from that. But his book on his grief has become a classic of the passage through grief from losing someone very close, and dies himself of heart failure in 1963. So in 1972, when I got that book of his given to me, that was only 9 years after he died. So he was a fairly recent memory for many people. Well, let's start in. Firstly, the Kilns. This is Lewis writing. And what we get from Lewis, much of what we have of the reflections of Lewis on his own life is in his book, Surprised by Joy, which is written before he met Joy, his wife, where he was exploring the notion of joy. And he gives us some quite profound details on the way in which he observed his own mind developing. So that's a book that everyone should read if you're interested in C.S. Lewis, his own account of his journey, spiritual journey. But talking of the house, he says this: the new house, because he was 5 years old when they purchased the house, the new house is almost a major character in my story. I'm a product of long corridors, empty sunlit rooms, upstairs, indoor silences, attics explored in solitude, also of endless books. There were books in the study, books in the drawing room, books in the cloakroom, books too deep in the great bookcase on the landing, books in the bedroom, books piled as high as my shoulder in the cistern attic, books of all kinds. Now, this period of childhood at the Kilns was the beginning of his imaginative life. He developed with his brother Warney this sense of a whole other world that he developed called Animal Land. And they made models of animals and made up stories about them. And there's some drawings of his still in existence of the figures he made in Animal Land. And so you get the beginnings of someone creating another world in his mind and in his understanding, Animal Land. But in 1908, everything comes crashing down when Florence Lewis, his mother, died. Now, Florence Lewis is an interesting person in her own right. She was 36 when he was born, so it was quite late in the 1890s for someone to give birth. And it was only her second child. She was the daughter of a Church of Ireland, which is the Church of England equivalent, so Anglican equivalent, priest, and herself was a graduate. So that picture in the middle there is of her graduation picture. So she was the intellectual impulse for Lewis, it would seem, from his family, at least anyway. His father, pictured on the top right there, Albert Lewis, was a solicitor, a bright man, but a very stodgy personality, it would seem. Very formal, very uninterested in a deep sort of emotional connection to his boys, which deepens, the problem of that deepens very dramatically after Florence Lewis dies in 1908, and this is his first major loss. He describes seeing his mother in bed and on her deathbed and not understanding what is going on, and then suddenly she's gone. She's not in the house anymore. And this, it appears, took him decades to recover from, if he ever really did. And soon, within months of Florence Lewis dying, and this is indicative of the problem with the relationship with his father, both boys were sent off to England to go to school, to boarding school. And the first school they went to, which was a school that Albert Lewis himself had been to briefly, was absolutely hated by C.S. Lewis. His brother Warnie had been there already for a year, but he describes it in his book as Belsen. And if you know the name Belsen, it's a concentration camp. Now, this is obviously written after World War II, this account. But intellectually, the time I spent in Belsen was almost entirely wasted. If the school had not died, because it folded after a year of him being there, no causal connection, I don't think. And if I'd been left there 2 years more, it would probably have sealed my fate as a scholar for good. All that rises out of the sea of arithmetic is a jungle of dates, battles, exports, imports, and the like, forgotten as soon as learned and perfectly useless if they'd been remembered. There was also a great decline in my imaginative life. For many years, joy, as I have defined it, was not only absent, but forgotten. Now, joy, we need to explore a little bit and get a sense of, because joy is this key concept for Lewis. Joy is described by him as an unsatisfied desire, which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. That is, it's a longing. You might translate it also, use alternative words for it like awe, longing, love, fear in the biblical sense, the Old Testament sense particularly. But particularly the feeling of wanting something. It's the wanting and the searching for it, which was the feeling that he's talking about. Not the finding of it. It's not the thing you find. It's the desire, the ache you have when you're looking for it and longing for it. The Maori word aroha can be used in this sense too, for longing. So it's the feeling that you get before you find the thing, and the finding of it's not the point. The desire itself, the longing is the thing which is most powerful. That sense of wanting something more and not knowing where it is, or knowing where it is and not being able to get there. The desire itself. This is an interesting concept, but it shapes the whole of Lewis's intellectual life. He's next sent, after the failure of Belsen, to a small public school, Malvern College, which is the subject of quite a long chapter in the book, Surprised by Joy, and he sees it as a more positive place to have been than Belsen. But it's here that you get a first introduction of some of the sort of challenging adult themes in Lewis's life, because he describes in quite a lengthy passage, but very matter-of-factly, what we would now call sexual abuse happening at a boarding school. He refers to it as the old-fashioned term pederasty, but matter of fact, he describes this as happening as a routine thing that would happen between older boys and younger boys, and rather dismisses it of being of very little importance. Lewis is characterized in his attitudes to sex that he treats sex in a very matter-of-fact way, and you'll see that coming through when we get to the four loves. It's not as if he treats it in a prurient or awkward way, but he's very matter-of-fact about it. He's untroubled by it. And this experience of pederasty, or what we would now call sexual abuse, tolerated institutional sexual abuse, he just dismissed as being, well, this is just normal. That's what happens at boys' schools. And he states quite plainly, didn't harm any of us really. So an interesting element that comes through in a number of other ways. Now, 2 years there, but then his father sends him to private tuition, and this is where things really take off for Lewis. He goes to the home of a man, William T. Kirkpatrick, the Great Knock, as he was known as. The Great Knock. Now, his father had spoken of Kirkpatrick, who had been his father's teacher at school, as this kindly, emotionally engaged, sensitive man who would take a real interest in the boys. Lewis found him to be the complete opposite. He imagined he was going to be this gentle person who would welcome him with open arms and sort of carrying him along on his shoulders to his home to look after him for a couple of years. But he found him to be the absolute opposite. If ever a man came to be near to being a purely logical entity, that man was Kirk. The idea that human beings should exercise their vocal organs for any purpose except that of communicating or discovering truth was to him preposterous. The most casual remark was taken as a summons to disputation. And he has a number of stories where, and in fact, the very first day he arrives, he realised afterwards some inane comment about how the countryside of Surrey is very pleasant. And immediately Kirk swings around on him and says, "Now what do you mean by pleasant? Define your terms. How do you know this? To what are you comparing it?" "I don't know." And for 2 years, this goes on, this sharpening of a philosophical, logical, tight mind, which gives Kirkpatrick an edge and gives Lewis an edge. Some boys would not have liked it. To me, it was red beef and strong beer. And this is important. The only two kinds of talk I wanted were the almost purely imaginative and the almost purely rational. Kirk excited and satisfied one side of me, obviously the purely rational side. Here was talk that was really about something. He was a man who thought not about you, but about what you said. My debt to him is very great, my reverence to this day undiminished. Now, as he alludes to there, a lot of boys would have found that impossible. But for Lewis, this was something which ignited something in him. But his reference there to the two kinds of talk he wanted is a good one for us to dwell on for a while. The purely imaginative and the almost purely rational. And here you come to a couple of important Greek concepts, the logos and the mythos. These are two ways in Greek understanding that truth is found. And they form these two poles in Lewis's mind, the rational and the imaginative. Logos is about counting, reckoning, rules, reason, logic, from which comes from this word, logos. Interesting enough, a word applied to Christ, of course. The logos, John's Gospel, chapter 1. And it's originally a mathematical term, which is describing the tangent of a triangle. The logos is in Greek mathematics, is a reference to the passage from 2 points in a triangle, the shortest point between them two. And that is applied to Christ in a obviously expanded form in John's Gospel. But this is the rational side of Lewis's mind. Mythos is that which relates to the imaginative side. It has to do with speech and narrative, plot, story, myths. And finding the mean between these two is going to be something which is going to drive Lewis, and at his conversion, you could say that this is the moment at which he does discover that, the way of combining these two in a profound way. But at the moment, when he's with Kirk, he's getting all this rationality, all this reason, all this logos. He wants the mythos, but he hasn't got it yet explained to him or helped to him. Now, just before having gone to Kirkpatrick's private school, or to his home really, he'd gone home briefly, and he and Warnie were reunited after Melbourne College, and they invented another imaginative land, this time called Boxen. So Boxen is much more developed than Animal Land. It's another fantasy where things happen and kingdoms rise and fall, and there are some more detailed notes from Lewis about Boxen. You can find books on Lewis's Boxen, B-O-X-E-N. It's not quite Narnia yet, but you can see the beginnings of that type of thinking in his young mind. You move forward to Oxford, to France, then back to Oxford between the period of 1917 and 1919. Kirkpatrick prepared him, and this was the goal, for entry to Oxford University, and prepared him very well, we will see. But of course, this was 1917, the World War I was underway. He got most of a first year at Oxford under his belt, and then he was called up to service, and Oxford effectively closed down. Now, during his time in service in the military, and that picture is of Lewis on the left and his friend Paddy Moore in service, he meets up with Paddy Moore and a number of other men with whom he strikes quite deep friendships. Male friendship is another theme which you need to keep in mind. Male friendship is hugely indicative of what happens in Lewis's life going forward. He loves the company of men, craves it in many ways. Now, interesting enough, Paddy Moore is often imagined to be, with people who've heard a bit about Lewis's story, to have been this deep connection that he made with a male friend whilst in the military, leading to a vow that they made to each other. They would look after the other's parent if one of them is killed. Now, it's probable actually that Paddy Moore was just one of many friends. Lewis hardly mentions him in most of his writings and connections of the time, his letters back and letters to other friends. He's mentioned along with others, but he's not mentioned in any special way. But he becomes more special in Lewis's mind because of his mother, Janie Moore. And both Janie Moore, the mother of Paddy, and Lewis seem to have attached themselves to each other almost immediately. There was an emotional connection between the two of them. She was 26 years older than Lewis, but became quite fascinated with him. Lewis travelled back during one of the holidays before going to the front with Paddy, and Mrs. Moore writes to Lewis's father, effusively talking about what a wonderful boy he is, and he's such an interesting person to talk to, and a lovely person. And Lewis starts writing to her directly, his own correspondence to her, and the pact that he makes with Paddy Moore during their time in France to look after each other's parent is effectively driven as much by his attraction to Mrs. Moore as it is to Paddy himself. It is, for instance, almost impossible to imagine that Albert Lewis would have welcomed Paddy Moore paying attention to him if the situation had been reversed. Paddy Moore is killed in action, and so Mrs. Moore and Lewis become connected. So Lewis returns to Oxford and effectively moves in with Mrs. Moore. Now, this in many ways is the obvious connection here, is this is a mother replacement. but it does appear that there's something more intimate going on than just that. He's very secretive about his relationship with Mrs. Moore. He doesn't talk about her to his friends. He keeps her as a secret from his father. He develops a code system to refer to her in his own diaries. And it's a very enigmatic relationship, this one. It's certainly codependent in some sort of way. And it lasts for 30 years, over 30 years. In fact, she dies in 1951. So this is a very important moment of being found by Lewis, most obviously as a mother replacement. But interesting enough, Mrs. Moore was unlike his own mother in many ways. She was not an intellectual person. She was uninterested in learning, and she was still married. She was a divorced woman, but well, which you'd say that's not quite still married. But her husband was still alive, and they both died in 1951. So she and Jane and her daughter Maureen became flatmates, effectively, with Lewis from about 1921 onwards in various houses until they together, between them, the two Lewis boys and Mrs. Moore, purchased the kilns together. And they co-own that building. And in fact, it stays within Maureen Moore's estate after Lewis and Warnie die, and certainly after Janie dies, and the boys have a life interest in it rather than an ownership of it. But Lewis, of course, has returned to Oxford now, and Oxford, you'd have to say, is his spiritual home and is certainly his intellectual home, where he really begins to thrive. Now, what you've got here by this stage is a person who has had a fractured life, who's gone through grief, who's lived through war, who's lost key friends, lost his mother, with a distant relationship with his father, and finds solace by taking up a life within an institution. He spends his life in institutions from that point onwards. So it's something to reflect upon, that this person, who is probably the most influential Christian writer of the 20th century, spent his entire life in institutions. He was not interested in, quote, the real world. He never kept up with international affairs or local affairs or read a newspaper. He never learnt to drive a car. In fact, he put some of those things down to the fact that he reckoned that he was missing a joint on his thumb. He and his brother apparently had a genetic problem where the joint on the thumb was non-existent, so he couldn't move his thumb in the way that anyone else can. So this apparently stopped him from driving. But he just didn't like modern technology, and so didn't bother. But yet he becomes this person that we all have heard about. So this is the end of the period of loss and alienation, because he's now found a home with Mrs. Moore, and he's found a spiritual and intellectual home at Oxford, which becomes his home forever, basically, until he dies. He changes his job later in the piece, but we'll see about that too. So if we go back to our timeline, we're now in the period of discovery, where life is changing and the world is opening up to him. Even though he's resistant to its modern forms, he's interested in it as a theoretical construct, and he wants to discover more about learning and the history of it. His first college is University College in Oxford, where he does his undergraduate study. Now, the way undergraduate study works in Oxford and Cambridge is that you're there for 3 years for your undergraduate degree. You complete a set of exams at the end of the first year, which is in Oxford known as the moderations, and then you complete a set of exams in your area of major at the end of 3 years. So you have no assignments other than written essays every week for every tutor, but they're not marked, they're just discussed and wrestled with. They don't become part of your grade. And there you are, Adam, there's something to think about. Having to write essays you don't get any credit for. That would be a bit sad, wouldn't it? Lewis has really quite a brilliant career as an undergraduate. He gains a first-class score in the moderations, end of year 1, which is quite a difficult task to reach. It's not unheard of, obviously, but that's a sign of a budding student, and anyone who would expect to enter an academic life would be expected to have achieved a first at the end of that first year. He then gets a second first, a genuine degree first in philosophy and Greek studies at the end of his 3 years. He stays on for a further year and does another honours degree in English literature. Now, English literature at the time, it was very Oxford-like. There was a division between those who regarded English as essentially the study of Middle and Old English, and those who discussed and examined modern authors, but modern was defined as anything after Geoffrey Chaucer, which is the 14th century. So very Oxford. And in 20th century literature, don't forget it. No one's going to study that. Lewis's world is mostly focused in English literature on the later period, the modern authors, the ones after Geoffrey Chaucer. But he obviously has built, through his other degree in philosophy and Greek, a very clear and deep understanding of the Greek world and the ancient world. In 1925, he becomes a fellow and tutor at Magdalen College. I know that's spelt Magdalen, and we always think it's going to be Magdalen in New Zealand, but it's actually there pronounced Magdalen. Don't ask me why, but they'll refer to the mother of Jesus as Mary Magdalene there too. So Magdalen College, which is, I mean, both these are lovely places. Magdalen College is just by the river in Oxford, and it's an absolutely fantastic setting. In the summer, it's a beautiful spot to see. And he was appointed as a fellow and tutor in English language and literature in 1925, a position he holds till 1954. Now you think, well, that's an interesting career, but actually, if that's all you do as an academic in Oxford, that's a failed academic career. Because to be a tutor, fellow and tutor, is the lowest rung of the ladder of academic life in Oxford. You do all the hard work. You're seeing students, 4 or 5 students a day, most days of the week, and dealing with them on an individual basis or sometimes as groups. But the real high flyers get professorships. They're made a professor of something, where they don't have to do tutoring anymore. They get paid for being very wise and learned, and they just give the occasional lecture. Lewis did not achieve any of that. He was never offered that at Oxford. And we might reflect a little bit later as to why that was. But here's this brilliant undergraduate student who's leading a double life, because as far as his academic world is concerned, he has to live in at the colleges. So he's living in his rooms during the week, and in the weekends going back to his world with Mrs. Moore. And the university world knows nothing about Mrs. Moore. His father knows nothing about Mrs. Moore. He keeps that from her, partly because his father's still funding him. So the concern will be that if he's aware that he's living with someone, then the father might not approve of this and might stop the money going. But living a double life at this time. And then 1929 comes along. And through the 1920s, Lewis is developing a deeper and deeper interest in myth, and particularly pagan myths, and things with deep meaning. Now, we tend to hear the word myth as if it's a story which is not true. Myth, as Lewis understood it, is something which is profoundly true, but not necessarily in its details. It's telling a truth. It's a story with meaning, and therefore a story which conveys a truth, like an Aesop's fable might convey a truth, although the story itself may never have happened. And you could say this of some of Jesus' parables. I mean, was there necessarily an actual man who went on the road to Jericho and was set upon by thieves? Or maybe not. The point is that Jesus is making a point. Parables are not necessarily a true story, but they're true in the sense of making a point. Now, this for Lewis is what he means by myth. And he's very interested in the pagan myths, the Greek and Roman myths particularly, and the Norse myths. So that a concept of joy, he'll often link to another concept he developed as a young person of northernness. When he read stories about Odin and the Greek, the Norse gods, this sort of gave him this sense of longing and mystery that he identified with joy. But he's more and more circling closer and closer to the notion of a Christian concept of God. And so in 1929, we reached his first point of conversion. But it's only his first conversion. The odd thing was that before God closed in on me, I was in fact offered what now appears a moment of wholly free choice. In a sense, I was going up Headington Hill on top of a bus. Without words, and I think almost without images, a fact about myself was somehow presented to me. I became aware that I was holding something at bay or shutting something out, or if you like, that I was wearing some stiff clothing like corsets or even a suit of armour, as if I were a lobster. I chose to open, to unbuckle, to loosen the rein. In the Trinity term of 1929, second half of the year, I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. He'd been up to this point an atheist. When he was at Malvern College back in his school days, he adopted a fairly high Anglican religiosity as a young child and found that quite helpful to get him through the school experience. But Kirkpatrick was an atheist and expressed no desire to encourage Lewis into any belief in God or religion. And Lewis imbibed this, so that by the time he reaches Oxford as an undergraduate student, he's a confirmed atheist. He doesn't believe in God anymore. He's pushed all that aside. And it's the philosophical engagement that he has which starts raising the question again, that what about this God question? Because it keeps coming up in philosophical terms. And he gets closer and closer to it, and in 1929 reaches this point of first conversion. And he says about it in Surprised by Joy, it must be understood that this conversion was only to theism, pure and simple, not to Christianity. I knew nothing about the incarnation. The God to whom I surrendered was sheerly non-human. So this is the God of the philosophers. This is the idea of God that he's finally convinced about. That there is a God, and if there is a God, then you might pray to this God. But as for Jesus Christ, didn't quite know how that fitted into the story, didn't need that at this point. This is the God of the philosophers, the God, if you like, of Logos. That this is the logical connection you might make, that you would receive an understanding of God which is just this, pure logic, and logic allows for God, in fact, compels you to God, was his conclusion. So you could say he's a theist, he believes in God, but he's not yet a Christian. So it's conversion number one, a logical conversion. Well, what happens then between 1929 and 1931? What changes? Well, God is closing in on him, as he himself described it. God is reaching out to him, and does that primarily through another major scholar, J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien was 6 years older than Lewis, but came from a similar emotional background in that his parents both had died by the time he was 11, and he was a devout Catholic. A devout Catholic because his mother, before she died, had become a devout Catholic, and he'd been enculturated into that, and he was a Catholic all his life, very keen and convinced Catholic. At Oxford, a few years before Lewis, his undergraduate career was not quite as stellar. He obtained a second-class honours in that first year examination, the moderations, but did get a first at the end of it in Old English and Middle English, which is his main interest. In 1916, he marries Edith, his wife. And Edith is a woman, although obviously not with the same age difference, although she is older. She's 4 years older than Tolkien. She's a woman very like Mrs. Moore, uninterested in intellectual life and quite impatient with the idea that Tolkien would see reading as a job. The reading can't be anything worthwhile doing if there's dishes to be done. Now, as for Mrs. Moore and the way their life operated, in this Alan Jacobs biography of Lewis, Jacobs quotes his brother, Warnie, whose diary entry for the day that Mrs. Moore died in 1951 describes what it was like living with her, because Warnie came to live with them as well. This is the later version of Mrs. Moore, of course. In the last 15 years of her reign, I don't think I ever saw Jack. His name was Clive, but he was known to all his friends as Jack from a very early age. And if your names were Clive Staples, you'd look for another one, wouldn't you? I don't think I ever saw Jay work more than half an hour without the cry of, "Four boys!" That was her nickname for Jack. "Coming, dear." Down would go the pen, and he would be away perhaps 5 minutes, perhaps half an hour, possibly doing nothing more important than stand by the kitchen range as a scullery maid. Then another spell of work, then the same thing all over again. These were the conditions under which all his books were produced. Mrs. Moore was uninterested in his intellectual life. Again, like Edith Tolkien, she couldn't understand why any man would spend their time reading. But Lewis stuck with it. Now, back to Tolkien. By 1922, he's a professor in English literature in Leeds, and in 1925 becomes the professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford. Now, he is 33 when he becomes a professor at Oxford. His undergraduate career was not as stellar as Lewis's, yet he's a professor very early. Lewis is not. And Lewis does not get that sort of advancement at Oxford at all. And from 1926 to 1939, these are the key years of friendship for Lewis. They meet in 1926, and Lewis's comment in his diary is this of Tolkien on his first meeting: "He's a smooth, pale, fluent little chap. No harm in him, only needs a smack or two." Now, why he would rate there being harm in him or not is because they represent two approaches to English literature, two different approaches to English literature. Tolkien is interested in the language, the philology it's called, of English literature. What changes happen in the language? And Tolkien's interest in writing The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit comes out of his desire to construct a new language. So he's experimenting from an early stage, Tolkien is, about writing new elfin languages and exploring the way language works. So he's a language expert. Lewis is very fluent and able to study Greek and Roman and so on, but he's not fascinated by language in the same way Tolkien is. He's interested in the story, in the mythos, in the way things play out. So he's a literature man, and these are two competing interpretations of English lit in Oxford at the time, and there's a bit of a battle goes on between them. So therefore, the two of them are a bit wary of each other when they first meet, because they're not sure whether the other one can be an ally or not. But they do become quite close allies, very close friends, and for those years up to 1939, particularly after the Second World War, Tolkien is the key friendship for Lewis and the key reason he enters his second conversion. And it's all to do with this concept of myth, which Tolkien, of course, is very interested in himself. So discovery again, this is where he embraces the myth. Now, the problem for Lewis, who now believes in God, is that he can believe in God as a logical construct. And as a consequence of that logical construct, you would pray to this God. So he has a prayer life. He goes to church. He goes through the ramifications of it, but he doesn't really grasp the Christian thing. And the fundamental problem for him is, well, God is one thing, but what about all this stuff about Jesus? What's going on there? Why would this God become a human being and sacrifice himself for us? That's just no different from a whole host of other pagan myths which don't mean much. Why would I take that seriously? Well, there's a walk in the park in the 19th of September 1931, where Hugo Dyson and Tolkien, Hugo being a Christian friend of Lewis's, and Tolkien, go for an evening walk with him on Addison's Walk, which is attached to Magdalen College. It's a walk along the river. That's a picture of part of it. Very privileged world these people live in, a very, very beautiful world that they existed in. And again, this is his account of what happens. This is a letter Lewis writes to another friend, a childhood friend, Arthur Greaves. Now, what Dyson and Tolkien showed me was this. In pagan stories, I was prepared to feel the myth as profound and suggestive of meanings beyond my grasp, even though I could not say in cold prose what it meant. So he could get the sense of it from pagan myths. He was prepared to concede that about pagan myths. Now, this is Lewis continuing. Now, the story of Christ is simply a true myth, but with a tremendous difference that it really happened. And one must be content to accept it in the same way, remembering that it is God's myth, where the others are men's myths. Now, don't get hung up by this word myth. Remember that for Lewis, it's a story with meaning. And it's not necessarily a meaning that you can define in logical terms, but it's one which changes your perception, changes your view, because that's the whole function of myth. It's another way of discovering truth that is not necessarily logical or defined or mathematically definable. So he comes to realize, and this is Tolkien's particular contribution to him, that Christianity is, yes, it is myth, but it happens to be true. Unlike all the other myths, this actually happened. This is a real event, and it's mythical in the sense that it creates meaning for us. And Lewis was set aback by this. And the next day, or within a few days, within a week, he's writing this also to Arthur Greaves. I know very well when, but hardly how, the final step was taken. I was driven to Whipsnade one sunny morning. When we set out, I did not believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, and when we reached the zoo, I did. Now, this ride is a ride on the back of his brother Warnie's motorbike. Again, Lewis can't drive, certainly can't drive a motorbike. So it's and the way the story actually unfolds on that day is there's an argument in the household. The four people, Mrs. Moore and her daughter Maureen, and Warnie and Lewis. And the day, in fact, starts out being fairly foggy, a little bit like this morning was. And the women are thinking, oh, let's not bother. Perhaps we won't bother going. The men are keen to go. So they come to this compromise that the men are going to set off anyway, that we'll just go. And if you want to follow in the car when the weather improves, then you can. Well, the weather does improve as they go along. And they have a lovely day at Whipsnade Zoo. But for Lewis, this thing has changed just on the journey. He doesn't know how it happened. He has no recollection of a sudden thought occurring to him, just that when he started, he didn't believe Jesus was the Son of God, and when he finished, he did. Power of myth. He suddenly accepted the myth, and he didn't have to define it, didn't have to explain it. He just grasped it. So we're back to this logos and mythos thing. For Lewis, these two parts of his mind are hugely important, and now finally they are reconciled, that he can both grasp logos and mythos in Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the answer to the reconciliation of these. He is the coming together of both these paths of truth, the story about Jesus is as important as our theology about Jesus. And this is actually one of the key sticking points for academic theology and Lewis. Academic theology tends to locate itself very firmly in the logos side of things. You start with first principles and you work from them. And the story and anything which depends on story is not rated as highly. And Lewis depends very much on story. And, we know Lewis through stories, most of us. But the story for Lewis was as important as the logical setting out of the ideas and the logic of it. So both logos and mythos are at this point reconciled for him in the person of Jesus Christ, and this is his actual conversion. This is his real conversion. And he's not reluctant at all about this conversion. This suddenly opens up everything to him. 1931. It also happens to be the same year that they purchase the kilns, and so a new life is beginning in all sorts of ways. So the new house, he's no longer, because he's a senior tutor, no longer having to spend as much time living in at the colleges, and he spends more and more time with Warnie and Mrs. Moore, Janie Moore and Maureen, and they live a life of domestic conflict, because there's a lot of conflict in that house, a lot of argument. And, what are you doing that for? Why are you spending time writing that? I need my hot water bottles heated, Mrs. Moore would say. And so he duly did it. And then he went back to his books. Warnie was a bit puzzled by this. Warnie was a confirmed bachelor and didn't see why anyone would be bothering with women's company much at all. But he was puzzled by this whole relationship, but he lived in with it because he was his brother's brother. And they were always very close. So he now is converted, 1931, halfway through his life. And he starts the second half of his life, this period of joy in operation, which runs from 1931 through to his marriage to Joy the woman in the late 50s. Now this unleashes for Lewis a highly creative period of writing. This is when we start getting his famous works starting to emerge. So over the next decade or so, you get a whole host of them. 1933, his first book is called The Pilgrim's Regress. He'd actually published a couple of books of poetry prior to this, but they're universally regarded as entirely forgettable, his attempts at poetry. He'd published a book of poetry in 1919, which ran through one edition and hardly sold any copies, and is regarded as fairly egregiously bad poetry. He published a couple of more accomplished pieces, but they're not seen as being the highly significant pieces that Lewis produced at all. 1933, The Pilgrim's Regress. Now, this list is organised so that on the left-hand side are the books of Christian apologetics, explaining Christianity to the world around him, essentially out of logos, but bringing in a bit of mythos to it, but primarily logos. In the middle are the imaginative works, which are primarily mythos. And then on the right-hand side are his more scholarly works. So The Allegory of Love and A Preface to Paradise Lost. He was, after all, a scholar of English literature and wrote some very important works on that. We'll talk about one of those next week in more detail, a rather big book that he wrote out of his scholarship. But what we're particularly interested in is the first two columns. The Pilgrim's Regress is a play on words from the Pilgrim's Progress. So it's the reverse of the Pilgrim's Progress. And it's really describing the way he lost faith and then regained it. So it's the regress. He sees himself as a child having had faith. Then he wanders away from it. And there's the story, John, the chief character in this allegory, is someone who wanders through a land and has to escape and finds his way back to his home eventually through the influence of a character called Mother Kirk. Now, Kirk is the Scottish word for church, Mother Church. And just remember that, because we'll reintroduce that concept when we get to Narnia, actually, the idea of Kirk. But Pilgrim's Regress is his first attempt at a truly imaginative writing, and it's not that successful. He doesn't sell very well, and even today when you read it, it doesn't have the zing of elements that other things that Lewis writes. It's not his most successful work. It's his first attempt at it, and for you and I, it'd be brilliant. But for Lewis, not quite there yet. Then he begins a series of novels, science fiction novels, Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, That Hideous Strength. These are adult novels. They're not children's novels. Were you saying, Roland, you'd read those? I hear you saying, yeah. What's your impression of them? Can you remember? Yep. They're not adult as being full of sex or anything like that, but they're written for adults is really what I'm saying. Yeah. Yeah. They're very reflective of the British world as he sees it, and the march of authoritarianism and so on. There's a lot of those images come through in the. Anyone else read the science fiction novels? Yeah. Um, they're clearly less bestsellers than the Narnia ones are, but they're interesting in themselves. And it's interesting, these are the first major fiction works that he goes to, uses science fiction as the medium for it. The Screwtape Letters, another work of imagination, and we're going to look at that in some detail in a minute. And The Great Divorce. The Great Divorce is an allegory of death in heaven, and that's a much more successful allegory than The Pilgrim's Regress is. Now, allegory is writing which has characters and situations in it which symbolize something else. So Pilgrim's Progress is one of the great examples of allegory. So you get characters like giant despair, which represents the despair that a Christian feels. So it's not actually there for the characterization itself, but what it represents. And some people have suggested to Lewis himself and later interpretations that the Narnia series are allegorical in that sense, and he would deny that. He says, no, they're not allegories. They don't represent something else. It's the story which matters. They're characters in a story. They're not, Lucy doesn't represent some type of Christianity or something like that. They're actually different. They're not allegories. But The Great Divorce is, and it's well worth the read, actually, The Great Divorce. It's very barbed in its attitude to the theology of the time, and particularly the theology of death and life. And it's a journey, a bus journey, which takes you through into the afterlife and what happens in that. The Problem of Pain is a logical logos response to the argument about suffering, written and published in 1940. What's happening in 1940? World War II. So this is a big issue for people. People are being killed, and there's a lot of suffering going on. So it's where Lewis uses that memorable image, which is sometimes used and certainly turns up in the film Shadowlands, that the pain is God's loudspeaker, basically, to us, to call us to attention, to make us pay attention to him. Now, The Problem of Pain is an apologetic work. It's part of his writing out of Logos, as are the broadcast talks, Christian Behaviour, and Beyond Personality, which are all of them radio talks, and they get gathered together in an amended form in Mere Christianity, which comes out in the 1950s. And we'll look at Mere Christianity and those broadcast talks volumes in next week's session. Then in 1947, he publishes Defense of Miracles as a concept, and that's quite an important one because of the response to it. A Christian philosopher, G.E.M. Anscombe, woman, Gertrude Anscombe, issues a reply to miracles where she critiques his argument. Now, Lewis was a searcher for truth, but he really liked winning an argument. He really didn't like losing an argument. And so the interpretation which is often placed on this interchange between Anscombe and Lewis is that Lewis's confidence in logic and the apologetic approach to explaining Christianity was rather dented by this, because it's certainly true that he issues a second edition a few years later with a heavily amended main chapter in the light of Anscombe's critique of his argument. So he accepted that his argument hadn't been as strong as it needed to be. But it's the same year, 1948, when he starts to write The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe series. And some interpretations of Lewis would say that he's now starting to lose a bit of faith in the logical apologetic approach to communicating Christianity and wants to shift his attention to the mythos approach of writing stories. And now, Anscombe, when she was interviewed about this some years later, rather poo-pooed this response, this interpretation of his response, and said, look, we had conversations afterwards where he was completely unfazed by my critique and accepted parts of it and debated parts of it. Didn't seem to bother him at all. So it's one of these things which interpreters rather overplay, I think. But it's interesting that by the end of the 40s, he's very committed now to writing myth, stories, and specifically stories for children. Now, the Time magazine on the side there. He was on the cover of Time magazine in September 1948. And the heading underneath it was His Heresy, Christianity. And the lead article, the cover story on it is entitled The Don and the Devil. And so here he's become a celebrity after all this broadcast work and publication and so on, which reached a lot of people. And it's been suggested that the broadcast talks were so popular that, and remember, radio is the key means of communication, of broadcast communication in the 1940s in England. Television's not operating in anything like the way that it approaches it after the war. It's in existence, but for wartime communication, it's hopeless. Lewis, they reckon, was the second most recognised voice on radio by this time. So very a great high notoriety attached to him at this point. So he becomes famous during the 1940s. That's why he gets on the cover of Time magazine. But he's famous and he's infamous, because the burden of the cover story in the Time magazine, the Don and the Devil, is here's this academic who seems to believe in God. How can that possibly be the case? Aren't academics beyond that sort of stuff? Doesn't he look a bit silly? And this is part of the reason why Lewis doesn't get those promotions at Oxford University. They respect his ability. He's seen as a wonderful tutor. Anyone who had Lewis as a tutor and writes about it afterwards is almost universally praising his ability as a tutor to get to the nub of issues and to guide them into their work. But he's a bit too popular in his approach. There's an enormous snobbery at him. Yes, primarily, yes. Yeah, in England, that's where, well, the fame goes beyond England, but the snobberish response is within England. In America, they lap him up, St. Clive. But in Britain, he's an outsider. He's Anglo-Irish, a bit of an outsider anyway. The class system wasn't operating in his favour, and no professorships, nothing like that, which you would have expected a person of this accomplishment to have achieved very early, in the same way that Tolkien did. He was offered a knighthood around about this time, but turns it down. And I haven't yet seen a satisfactory explanation of why that was, actually. Some would suggest that he was just a humble man who didn't like attention, and that's partly true, but they don't cite any evidence for it. So I'm a little bit interested in that one. As to somewhere in the archives of Britain, there will be a letter from him saying, no thanks, I won't accept the knighthood, but no one's quite found it yet. But Lewis is seen as being now, he is a controversial figure. He's a famous person, probably the most famous academic in Britain at the time, but famous for his advocacy for Christianity, which is a little bit naff in academic circles. Oh, that's a bit old-fashioned, isn't it? A bit embarrassing, really. What are we going to do with Lewis? And you see this, if you've seen the film Shadowlands, they portray that a bit, actually. The sort of, come on, boy, what's the matter with you? And Time magazine picked up on that. So his heresy is seen as being Christianity, which, of course, in America is still a badge of honor. But in Britain, by now, it's a much more cynical world, and they're not thinking the same way. During this period, too, you get the Inklings, which is a group of writers like Lewis. Lewis is the absolute centre of the Inklings. Lewis and Tolkien are the two key figures, but Lewis is the centre of it. He's the one who's there at every meeting. It's a mixed group, mostly Lewis's friends, and described by Jacobs as a society in which formerly lonely and isolated men discovered that it was not so necessarily so crazy to believe in God and miracles or to write stories about elves and dwarfs. It was a drinking club. So they met regularly at the Eagle and Child pub, photographed there, which is not operating now in Oxford, but it's being rebuilt. So the facade is going to be in existence still, but it's being turned into a upper class accommodation. But you could, up until fairly recently, go in there and sit in the seats that the Inklings used to sit at in a particular room. And the Eagle and Child, or known as the Bird and Baby in local parlance, is on one of the main streets in Oxford, and actually quite close to the Baptist College in Oxford, Regent's Park College. But the Inklings, particularly Tolkien's presence there, are part of this flourishing of his writing. They begin in the 1930s. They start to fade a little bit from the 1940s onwards, but they're still present right through to Lewis's death, and it's a place for people to read to each other their writings. Tolkien and Lewis are the two outstanding figures in it in terms of the significance of their writings. Charles Williams is another. He was an editor from Oxford University Press and wrote spiritual murder mysteries, oddly enough. They're rather peculiar things. They're a niche market, Charles Williams. Lewis rather liked Charles Williams, and it was Williams arrives in 1939 because Oxford University Press moves from London back to Oxford because of the war, and Lewis starts to transfer his attention more to Charles Williams than he does to Tolkien. So Tolkien and Lewis remain friends, but their friendship is no longer as intense as it was from the beginning of the war onwards. So the Inklings are part of his formation, and again, male friendship. No women in the Inklings, and particularly friendship which is built around smoking a pipe and drinking beer. Very important to him. And in the Four Loves, one of the Four Loves is friendship. And what you hear described there, people who knew the Inklings and were part of the Inklings, they would say his analysis of what friendship is and should be is a idealized description of what he imagined the Inklings to be. Mostly men. And he's actually quite specific about that in the Four Loves, that it doesn't really work for women. Now that raises a theme about how well does Lewis understand women, and the general response from many women who've studied him is not particularly well. But we'll come to that. And then Screwtape. Well, the Screwtape letters require you to exercise your imagination. And some conservative Christians have found Screwtape letters a bit awkward, a bit difficult, because you are required to put yourself in the mind of a devil, of a demon, who is involved in tempting human beings. So everything in it is reversed. So when the letters contain a reference to the enemy is God in Screwtape. Now Lewis, of course, is not endorsing this, but what he writes is an analysis of how the psychological process of temptation works and how the challenges to our faith operate as if we're hearing the backstory amongst these demons who are discussing how we're going to bring this Christian down. So it's quite brilliant in the way it does it, and we're going to read a few parts of it in a minute. It's likely that it arose because he had been himself listening to some of the early broadcasts of Adolf Hitler, which were beamed into Britain, of course. And he realised that there are times, when you listen to this convincing man, you end up being half convinced when you're listening to it. It almost seems logical and real. And we've all had that experience, haven't we? There's something that you end up stepping back from and saying, whoa, I hate that. But when you're in the middle of it, you can sometimes think, well, they might have a point. And it's only when you get a bigger perspective on it that you see things differently. And he sees this as part of the subtle way in which the devil gets at us. And you'll see some examples of what he means. But his letter to his brother Warney in July 1940 says this: I was struck by an idea for a book, which I think might be both useful and entertaining. It would be called As One Devil to Another, and would consist of letters from an elderly retired devil to a young devil who has just started work on his first patient, it being the human being. The idea would be to give all the psychology of temptation from the other point of view. That's a picture of the first edition there, published in very Spartan war conditions. This is a second edition, published in 1950, but the book itself, it has no cover, of course, but the book itself is exactly the same as the first edition, and interestingly enough, it is dedicated to J.R.R. Tolkien. So this is a first popular work of imaginative fiction, the one that really takes off, published in 1942. Now, in the preface to the Screwtape Letters, we read this: I have no intention of explaining how the correspondence which I now offer to the public fell into my hands. These started out, they were published as letters, individual letters in the Guardian newspaper, but the Guardian newspaper then was not the Manchester Guardian, which is the forerunner to the modern Guardian newspaper in Britain. It was a Church of England in-house newspaper called The Guardian, and that's what he's writing for. I have no intention of explaining how the correspondence which I now offer to the public fell into my hands. There are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to believe in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel one is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased by both errors and hail a materialist, the non-believer, or a magician with the same delight. The sort of script which is used in this book can be very easily obtained by anyone who has once learned the knack, but disposed or excitable people who might make a bad use of it shall not learn it from me. Readers are advised to remember that the devil is a liar. Not everything that Screwtape says should be assumed to be true, even from his own angle. I have made no attempt to identify any of the human beings mentioned in the letters, but I think it very unlikely that the portraits, say, of Father Spike or the patient's mother are wholly just. There is wishful thinking in hell as well as on earth. Now, it opens in the first letter with a acknowledgement that Wormwood, the junior devil, who received these letters from Uncle Screwtape, has just received his first commission, his first job, his first patient. And his job is to make sure that this patient does not enter heaven and is secured for the purposes of hell. The second letter, which we're going to read, happens after the man becomes a Christian, which is a bit disturbing, but not seen as the end of the world by the demons, as you'll see. So, my dear Wormwood, the second letter starts. I note with grave displeasure, with grave displeasure, that your patient has become a Christian. Do not indulge the hope that you will escape the usual penalties. Indeed, in your better moments, I trust you would hardly even wish to do so. In the meantime, we must make the best of the situation. There's no need to despair. Hundreds of these adult converts have been reclaimed after a brief sojourn in the enemy's camp and are now with us. All the habits of the patient, both mental and bodily, are still in our favour. One of our great allies at present is the Church itself. Now, do not misunderstand me. I do not mean the church as we see her spread, but through all time and space and rooted in eternity, terrible as an army with banners, that, I confess, is a spectacle which makes our boldest tempters uneasy, but fortunately is quite invisible to these humans. All your patient sees is the half-finished, sham Gothic erection on a new building estate. When he goes inside, he sees the local grocer, with rather an oily expression on his face, bustling up to offer him one shiny little book containing a liturgy which neither of them understands, and one shabby little book containing corrupt texts of a number of religious lyrics, mostly bad and in very small print. Now remember, Lewis is writing out of an Anglican world, so the Book of Common Prayer and hymns ancient and modern is what he's referring to there. When he gets to his pew and looks around him, he sees just that selection of his neighbours whom he has hitherto avoided. And you want to lean pretty heavily on those neighbours, make his mind flit to and fro between an expression like the body of Christ and the actual faces in the next pew. It matters very little, of course, what kind of people the next pew really contains. You may know one of them to be a great warrior on the enemy's side, God's side. No matter. Your patient, thanks to our Father below, the devil, is a fool. Provided that any of these neighbours sing out of tune, or have boots that squeak, or double chins, or odd clothes, the patient will quite easily believe that their religion must therefore be somehow ridiculous. At his present stage, you see, he has an idea of Christians in his mind, which he supposes to be spiritual, but which in fact is largely pictorial. His mind is full of togas and sandals and armour and bare legs, and the mere fact that the other people in the church wear modern clothes is a real, though of course an unconscious, difficulty for him. Never let it come to the surface. Never let him ask what he expected them to look like. Keep everything hazy in his mind now, and you'll have all the eternity wherein to amuse yourself by producing in him the peculiar kind of clarity which hell affords. Work hard then on the disappointment or anticlimax which is certainly coming to the patient during his first few weeks as a churchman. The enemy allows this disappointment to occur, the enemy being God, on the threshold of every human endeavour. It occurs when the boy who has been enchanted in the nursery by stories from the Odyssey buckles down to really learn Greek. It occurs when lovers have got married and begin the real task of learning how to live together. In every department of life, it marks the transition from dreamy aspiration to laborious doing. The enemy takes this risk, God takes this risk, because he has a curious fantasy of making all these disgusting little human vermin into what he calls his free lovers and servants. Sons is the word he uses, with his inveterate love of degrading the whole spiritual world by unnatural liaisons with two-legged animals. Desiring their freedom, he therefore refuses to carry them by their mere affections and habits to any of the goals he sets before them. He leaves them to, quote, do it on their own. And there lies our opportunity. But also, remember, there lies our danger. If once they get through this initial dryness successfully, they become much less dependent on emotion and therefore much harder to tempt. Now, this is vintage Lewis, very suspicious of emotions and very keen on the notion that human beings respond to God out of freedom and are essentially left to get on with it. He's a person who believes in getting on with life. There's a line in the Narnia stories where the final battle is just about to begin with the White Witch, and the oldest boy, whose name escapes me for a moment, Peter, says, "Well, you'll be with us, won't you?" To Aslan. And Aslan says, "Well, actually, no, I won't be. You've got everything you need. Just get on with it." That's very Lewis, and that's very much the spiritual world he's describing here. Very little about the Holy Spirit in this, being the enabler or the guide or the assistant. And you'll probably find that that's true of Lewis through all his theology, actually, that he doesn't have a high role, active role for the Spirit in that sense. But here he's saying that the danger point for Christians is when they get their first rush of enthusiasm over and then they find out that they're meeting up with other Christians. And so the best advantage that the devils have is all these other Christians that surround them. the local greengrocer with his shiny, oily face, handing out the hymn books. Ugh. Why would I be attracted to them? Why would I want to be part of them? Now, I've been writing hitherto on the assumption that the people in the next pew afford no rational ground for disappointment. Of course, if they do, if the patient knows that the woman with the absurd hat is a fanatical bridge player, I don't quite know what is wrong with being a fanatical bridge player, but he didn't like it, or the man with the squeaky boots is a miser and an extortioner, then your task is so much easier. All you then have to do is to keep out of his mind the question, if I, being what I am, can consider that I am in a sense a Christian, why should the different vices of those people in the next pew prove that their religion is mere hypocrisy and convention? Keep that thought out of his mind. You may ask whether it's possible to keep such an obvious thought from occurring even to a human mind. It is, Wormwood, it is. Handle him properly and it simply won't come into his head. He has not been anything like long enough with the enemy, God, to have any real humility yet. What he says, even on his knees, about his own sinfulness is all parrot talk. At bottom, he still believes he has run up a very favourable credit balance in the enemy's ledger by allowing himself to be converted, and thinks that he's showing great humility and condescension in going to church with these smug, commonplace neighbours at all. Keep him in that state of mind as long as you can. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. Now, here's Lewis allowing his imagination to drive the narrative, to drive the theology which he might otherwise explain through a series of logical, philosophical discourses. But this is a story now of the interaction between demons. And the book goes on through various stages of this man's life and various to's and fro's and successes and failures in his Christian life, and reaches a point where the man is actually lost, but lost to the demons. Now, if you're planning to read it, I won't spoil the ending for you, but Wormwood fails, and therefore Screwtape fails, because the man has succeeded in building faith and holding faith together. But primarily it's a very stiff upper lip British type of faith. You know, get on with it. Get on with it, doing it. Be faithful and just get on with the job. Now, Screwtape is the second most best-selling book of Lewis's. It's outsold any of the individual Narnia books. Particularly big in the United States. I was quite surprised by that fact, actually, because I have heard very little debate of it in recent years, but it still sells very well, particularly in the United States, and is an example of the early use by Lewis of the idea of the mythos idea, of imagination at work and so on. Now, things shift for Lewis from the 1950s onwards, as we'll see that next week in some detail. Mrs. Moore passes away. His life at the kilns changes. His reputation changes. He changes his job at some point. He gets married. He continues to write, but his writing is more and more dominated by scholarship, which carries on, and the Narnia series, which we'll come to in 2 weeks' time. But next week we'll look at his attempts to define and respond to faith questions during wartime with the broadcast talks and their publication ultimately as Mere Christianity and the impact of Mere Christianity on the Christian world, which is his best-selling book of all. Who's read Mere Christianity at some point in their life? It's worth reading. But you'll find it's very of its time. And we'll look at this a bit more detail next week, but there are colleges and Christian organizations in the United States which have it as their statement of belief, that if you can sign up to the picture of Christianity depicted in Lewis's Mere Christianity, then you're allowed in. Now, you wonder if they've actually read it, when they're doing that, because there are some things in it which you wouldn't be quite so sure of now. But on the whole, it's actually a very powerful rendering. Yep. Mm. Yeah, the human person and the change of view of what makes the human person is an important part of the book for him, and a big part of what he understands our response as Christians to God is like. Depends on how you understand what it is to be human. Yeah, yeah, and he that's certainly his position, the idea of natural law and so on. Yeah, and we'll look at that in some detail next week. Yeah. Any other reflections or comments on this first part of Bruce and then Sarah? Yeah. Yep.
You've spoken at great length on the conversion of Lewis
Yep.
without mentioning the word sin.
Mm.
We have been taught that when you counsel someone, you must highlight their sins and get them to repent.
Mm.
Does Lewis's experience suggest there may be an alternative way of handling this situation?
Well, it certainly was for him. Yeah, so is sin big for him? Well, he certainly acknowledges the problem of sin, but he's much more relaxed. And this is what comes back to that sort of matter-of-fact view of sexuality and so on that he has. He's much less troubled about individual sins. He recognizes sin as a problem of separation between us and God, but he's much more matter-of-fact about individual sins and things that people do wrong. He is, he's a hail fellow well met, and there's some articles on him which, for instance, talk about the relationship with Mrs. Moore, and they're headed up, C.S. Lewis, sin or sanctification, trying to describe this relationship, and he doesn't get converted out of a strong consciousness of being a depraved individual. That's certainly true. He just needed to grasp the story. Yeah. Sarah. Warney. Yes, Warney was a Christian. Warney became a Christian before Lewis did, actually, same year, but had never become a confirmed atheist in the way that C.S. Lewis had. But yeah, Warney was very much a traditional Anglican churchman, and actually a reasonable scholar in his own right. He was a military man, so actually his career was in the army, but he wrote a couple of history books which were quite well received. Nothing of the outstanding nature of C.S. Lewis's stuff, but he's pictured in the movies as a very sort of ponderous, sort of slow-speaking sort of foil to C.S. Lewis, actually, but he was probably much more lively than that. But yes, he was a Christian. Yeah. No, there's no sign, interesting enough, that Mrs. Moore ever was. She was quite sceptical, and similar to the J.R.R. Tolkien, Mrs. Edith Tolkien was very sceptical about religion too. Certainly very sceptical about Catholicism. Didn't want really anything to do with it. And was not a non-church attender. Anything else? All right. Well, next week we'll look at those first apologetic works and how they play into the context of the times. So remember, they're the product of wartime. So he's writing out of the doubts and concerns that people have at wartime, and we'll try to understand his system of thinking, the way he thinks about how God operates and how human beings operate, and the nature of humanity, as we examine that. And we'll look at some of his other works around the same period as well.